The Galactic Council chamber was the largest room ever built by any species. In known space, it floated at the center of the orbital station called the throne of Accord, a massive ring of metal and glass that hung above a dead world. No one remembered the name of 342 species sent their representatives. Here they argued, they traded, they made deals that decided the fate of billions, and above all else they believed in one sacred truth, that every problem in the galaxy could be solved with the right bargain. Ambassador Alara Voss had been humanity's voice in this chamber for 7 years. She was a tall woman with dark skin and silver hair cut short against her skull. She spoke softly and smiled. Often the other ambassadors liked her. They said she was reasonable. They said she understood how things worked, and they were about to find out how wrong they were. It started with a signal. Short, ugly burst of data that cut across every communication channel in the chamber like a knife through cloth. The holographic display at the center of the room flickered, and then the face of Warlord Kajetan of the Galactic Dominion filled the space where trade agreements had been projected moments before. He was enormous. The Galactic were a reptilian species, broad and armored, with natural bone plates across their skulls and shoulders. Kajetan was the largest of his kind anyone had ever seen. His eyes were yellow and split down the middle with black slits, and when he spoke, his voice was deep enough to vibrate the floor panels beneath the ambassador's feet. He told them what he had done 12 hours ago in Galactic. Battle fleet of 40 warships had dropped out of hyperspace above a small human colony world called New Thessaly. It was not an important world. It had no military value. It was a farming colony of 40,000 people who grew engineered wheat and raised cattle in wide green valleys beneath a pale blue sun. There were schools there, hospitals, a small university that was famous for nothing except its surprisingly good poetry department. Kajetan had taken all of it. His soldiers had landed in the fields and marched into the towns and rounded up every man, woman, and child, and now he had demands. He wanted 3 strategic hyperspace corridors that would give the Galactic Dominion control of a quarter of the galaxy's fastest trade routes. But he wanted 10 mineral-rich systems that humanity had spent decades surveying and developing, and snorts. He wanted a formal public declaration of submission from the Terran Confederacy, broadcast on every channel in every language, so that the whole galaxy would know that humanity had bent its knee. If these demands were not met within 100 hours, Kajetan would begin killing colonists 1,000 per cycle. He would broadcast every execution live. He would make the galaxy watch. The transmission ended. The chamber was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then it exploded. 342 species began talking at once. The noise was incredible. Translators struggled to keep up. Ambassadors shouted across the aisles at each other. Some were outraged at the Galactic. Most were not. Most were simply calculating. This was, and after all, how things worked. The Larathi ambassador was the first to approach. Alara Voss. The Larathi were an old species, tall and thin with pale skin that shifted color with their moods. They had been part of the council for thousands of years, and they understood its rhythms better than anyone. The Larathi ambassador's name was Counselor Yathani, and she moved through the chaos with the calm grace of someone who had seen this exact situation play out dozens of times before. She sat down next to Voss and spoke gently. Ambassador, I understand this is difficult, but you must be practical. The Vrelak have done this to others. The Shalon paid their price, the Morexi paid theirs. Even my own people long ago paid a price. To end a crisis like this, you negotiate. You give them something. Perhaps not everything they ask for, but enough to satisfy their pride. You get your people back and then you rebuild. This is how the galaxy survives. Voss listened. She did not interrupt. Her face showed nothing. Other ambassadors came. The Shalon Merchants Guild representative, a small creature covered in iridescent scales, offered to help pay whatever the Vrelak demanded. He called it an investment in stability. The Ureth Collective, a hive mind species that spoke through a single drone body, warned that military action would destabilize 12 trade networks and crash the economies of 40 systems. Even species that had never spoken to Voss before came to her seat and urged her, with varying degrees of politeness, to do the sensible thing, be practical, be smart, pay the price, save your people. Voss thanked every single one of them. She was polite, she was warm, she shook hands and tentacles and manipulator appendages, and she said she appreciated their concern and their advice. Then she walked to the center of the chamber and asked to speak. The room quieted. It took a while. 342 species do not go silent quickly, but eventually every eye and sensor and audio receptor in the room was focused on the human woman, standing alone in the middle of the largest room ever built. She did not raise her voice. I have listened to your counsel, she said, and I thank you for it. Many of you have survived situations like this, and I respect the experience behind your words. You have told me to negotiate. You have told me to pay the price. You have told me this is how the galaxy works. She paused. The silence was absolute. But I must tell you something about my species, something that I think many of you have not yet understood, despite 7 years of sitting in this chamber together. She took a breath. We don't do this. We don't bargain with people who hold guns to the heads of children. We don't reward people for murder. We don't teach the galaxy that if you kill enough humans, you can buy yourself an empire. The Lorathi ambassador's skin turned pale, a sign of deep alarm among her species. I have sent a message to my government, Voss continued. Their response will be broadcast on open channels within the hour. I wanted you to hear it from me first, so you would understand that this is not anger, this is not pride. This is policy, this is who we are. She stepped back from the center and returned to her seat. 40 minutes later, Serdek Terran Confederacy's response arrived on every open frequency in the galaxy. It was one sentence long. The Terran Confederacy does not negotiate with those who hold guns to the heads of children. The chamber erupted again, but this time it was different. This was not the busy noise of calculation. This was fear. Because every species in the room understood something that the Vrelak apparently did not, that when you refuse to bargain, there is only one other option. The Lorathi ambassador rushed to Voss's seat. Her skin was cycling through colors so fast it was almost painful to watch. Ambassador, please reconsider. You are a young species. You do not understand the consequences of what you are doing if you refuse to negotiate. The Vrelak will kill those colonists. All of them, and then what? War with the Vrelak Dominion. What if they have been conquering worlds since before your species learned to make fire? Voss looked at her, and for the first time the Lorathi ambassador saw something in the humans' eyes that she had never seen in 7 years of friendship. It was not anger. Anger she could have understood. Anger was hot and fast, and it burned out. This was something colder, something that went deeper than emotion. It was the look of a species that had already done the math, already counted the cost, and already decided it was willing to pay every single coin. Counselor Yathani, Voss said quietly, you told me that your people paid a price long ago to end a crisis like this, and I believe you. But I want you to think about something. After you paid that price, did it stop? Did the next warlord look at what happened and say, I should not do that? Because the Lorathi will not tolerate it. Or did the next warlord look at what happened and say, the Lorathi will pay? Let me take something of theirs and see how much I can get. The Lorathi ambassador said nothing. Her skin went very, very still. That is why we don't negotiate, Voss said, not because we are brave, not because we are proud, because we learned a long time ago on our own world that feeding the wolf does not make the wolf go away. It makes the wolf come back. And it makes the wolf hungrier. She stood and gathered her things. The session was over for her. There was nothing left to say in this chamber. Everything that mattered now would happen far from here in the cold silence of space, where humanity's real answer was already being prepared. As she walked toward the exit, and her aide, a young Shalom translator named Fessy, who had worked with her for 3 years, hurried to keep up. Fessy's scales were dark with worry. Ambassador, Fessy whispered, the council thinks you are being foolish. They think pride is making you risk 40,000 lives. Boss stopped walking. She looked down at Fessy with an expression that was almost gentle. They think we are being proud, she said softly. They don't understand. We are being angry. She walked out of the chamber. Behind her, 342 species watched her go. And for the first time in the long history of the Galactic Council, not one of them had a single idea what was going to happen next. Far away in the cold dark between stars, ships were already moving. Beneath the surface of Mars, buried under 3 km of red rock and iron, there was a room that did not officially exist. It was listed in no government database. It appeared on no map. The people who worked there did not talk about it when they went home to their families, and their families had learned long ago not to ask. The room was called the Pit, and it was the beating heart of Terran Confederate Command. Admiral Idrissa Okonkwo walked into the pit at exactly 6:00 in the morning, Mars Standard Time. He was a tall man, lean and dark-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of calm face that made people think he was always slightly bored. He was never bored. His mind was always working, always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of whatever situation the galaxy had decided to throw at humanity this time. He had been woken up 2 hours ago by a call from the Confederate president. The call had lasted 90 seconds. Most of those seconds had been silence because there was very little that needed to be said. A colony had been taken. Citizens had been captured. A warlord was making demands. The president had spoken one sentence that mattered. Doctrine 7, Admiral, you have full authority. Okonkwo had said, understood, and the call had ended. Now he stood in the pit, looking at the massive holographic display that filled the center of the room. It showed the new Thessaly system in perfect detail. The pale blue star, the colony world, turning slowly in its orbit, and the red markers that represented 40 Vrel warships surrounding it like wolves around a wounded animal. His staff was already assembled, 32 of the best military minds in human space, sitting at their stations, all waiting for him to speak. They had all been woken by the same call. They all knew what Doctrine 7 meant. Okonkwo did not rush. He studied the display for a full minute in silence. Then he spoke. Show me everything we know about the Vrel fleet composition. Data filled the air, ship classes, weapon systems, shield configurations, troop numbers. The Vrel were not a subtle species when it came to war. Their ships were big, heavily armed, and built to intimidate. They had been conquering smaller species for 600 years with the same approach. Show up with overwhelming force, make terrible threats, and wait for the other side to fold. It had always worked. Before, Okonkwo studied the data and saw what he expected to see. The Vrel fleet was powerful, but it was configured for intimidation, not for a real fight. Their ships were spread wide around the planet in a display formation designed to look impressive on long-range sensors. Their shields were at standard power, not combat power. Their fighter wings were docked, not deployed. They were not expecting a fight. They were expecting a negotiation. This was going to be their last mistake. Pull up the deployment status of the 4th, 7th, and 12th strike fleets, Okonkwo said. More data appeared. The 3 fleets were scattered across human space, some at base, some on patrol, some running training exercises. Moving them into position without being detected would be the hardest part of the operation. The galaxy was full of sensors, listening posts, and nosy trade ships that would report any large fleet movement to anyone willing to pay for the information. But humanity had spent the last 60 years quietly mapping something that no other species knew about, a network of gravitational blind spots between star systems where hyperspace jumps could be made without triggering any known detection grid. They were dangerous routes. The navigation calculations required to use them were so complex that most species computers could not perform them at all. Human computers could, but only barely. And every jump carried a small but real chance of catastrophic failure. Okonkwo was going to use every single one of those routes. I want the 4th and 7th converging on New Thessaly through the Black Line routes, he said. Full stealth protocol, no active sensors, no communications except tight beam laser relay. They go dark the moment they leave. Doc, his operations officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Commander Petrov, nodded and began entering orders. The 12th Fleet, Okonkwo continued, takes the deep route through the Harlan Gap. He paused, to Vrelok Prime. The room went very quiet. Every officer in the pit understood what that meant. The 12th Fleet was not going to New Thessaly. It was going to the Vrelok homeworld. It was going to appear in orbit above a planet of 9 billion Vrelok and remind them personally, directly, and undeniably that their warlord had gambled their lives along with everyone else's. Commander Petrov looked at the admiral. Sir, the 12th's orders are they weapons free? No, Okonkwo said. The 12th does not fire unless fired. Upon they arrive, they hold position. Show or they make sure every Vrelak on that planet can look up at their sky and see what their warlord's choices have brought to their doorstep. And if the Vrelak homeworld defense fleet engages them, then the 12th defends itself with full force, and I will have a very different conversation with Vrelak Prime about what happens next. Petrov nodded and turned back to her console. Okonkwo spent the next 3 hours building the operation piece by piece. He was not a man who believed in grand gestures or heroic charges. He believed in planning. He believed in preparation. He believed that wars were won in rooms like this one, hours and days before the first shot was fired, by people who had thought of everything that could go wrong and prepared for all of it. He named the operation. He called it Absolute Answer. So while the fleets were being prepared, there was another piece of the plan that needed to move. First, Okonkwo called in Captain Rhea. Chen was 31 years old, small and wiry, with black hair pulled back tight, and eyes that never seemed to blink. Enough. She was a special operations intelligence officer, which was a polite way of saying that she went to dangerous places alone and did things that no one would ever thank her for publicly. She stood in front of Okonkwo's desk and listened as he explained what he needed. We need eyes on the ground in New Thessaly, he said. I need to know the exact positions of every Vrelak unit on that planet. I need to know where our people are being held. I need to know the locations and power status of every shield generator, every anti-orbital battery, and every communications relay. Yeah, and I need all of it within 72 hours. Chen did not ask how she was supposed to get to a planet surrounded by 40 warships. She had already figured that out. There was a stealth insertion pod in the armory that was designed for exactly this kind of mission. It was small, it was fast, and it was coated in a material that absorbed sensor signals like a sponge absorbing water. Getting in would not be the hard part. The hard part would be everything after. Rules of engagement, she asked. Observe and report. Do not engage Vrelak forces unless civilian lives are in immediate danger. Link up with any local resistance and coordinate for the ground phase of the operation. What ground phase? Okonkwo almost smiled. You'll know when it starts. Chen left the pit and was off planet within 4 hours, when Aina heard tiny pod slipping through the dark like a needle through black cloth. While she traveled, Okonkwo received updates from across human space. Response to the crisis was unlike anything he had seen in his 30 years of service. Civilian transport captains were volunteering their ships for supply runs. Retired Snort's military personnel were showing up at recruitment offices and asking to be reactivated. Factories that made farming equipment were quietly switching their production lines to military components, not because anyone ordered them to, but because the workers had voted on it during their lunch breaks. This was the thing about humans that the galaxy never seemed to understand. They looked at humanity and saw a young species barely 3 centuries into space travel when they saw a species that was friendly and curious and like to trade and explore and make terrible jokes. They saw a species that smiled a lot and threw parties for no reason and cried at sad movies. And because they saw all of this, they assumed that humans were soft. They did not understand that all of those things, the kindness, the humor, the warmth, existed precisely because humans had spent their entire history fighting against their own capacity for destruction. Humans were not peaceful because they did not know violence. Humans were peaceful because they knew violence so well, so intimately, so deeply that they had built their entire civilization around the project of keeping it contained. But contained was not the same as gone. And when someone tore open the container, when someone killed human children and broadcasted to the stars as a negotiating tactic, what came out was something that the galaxy had never seen and was absolutely not prepared for. 48 hours into the operations preparation, a new report arrived from New Thessaly. Captain Chen had made it to the surface. She had linked up with the colonists, and she had confirmed what Okonkwo had feared. The Vrelak had already executed 200 civilians, men and women and children lined up in the colony's central plaza and shot, while cameras recorded everything. The footage had been broadcast galaxy-wide. Kajetan had called it a demonstration of seriousness. Okonkwo read the report in his office. Alone, he read it twice, then he set it down on his desk and sat very still for a long time. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Fassel, came in 20 minutes later with a scheduling update and found the Admiral exactly where he had left him. Okonkwo's face had not changed, his posture had not changed, but something in the room felt different, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees. Sir, Fassel said carefully, move the timetable up 48 hours. Okonkwo said. His voice was the same as always, calm, measured, precise, and add a secondary operational objective. Fassel pulled up his tablet. What's the secondary objective, sir? Okonkwo looked at him. His eyes were steady and dark and absolutely empty of mercy. When the 4th and 7th are done at New Thessaly, they do not return to base. They proceed directly to Vrelak, sovereign space, and systematically disable every military shipyard, every weapons factory, and every fleet staging area the Vrelak Dominion possesses. Every single one. I want them left with nothing, not enough to threaten a trade ship, not enough to bully a colony, nothing. Fassel stared at him. Sir, that's the Vrelak have military installations in over 40 systems. Then it will take some time, Okonkwo said. Make sure the supply lines can support an extended campaign. Sir, the Galactic Council will. The Galactic Council had their chance to solve this problem with words. They chose to tell us to pay the ransom. They chose to tell us that this is how the galaxy works. Okonkwo stood up. He was not a physically imposing man, but in that moment, standing in his quiet office, beneath the surface of Mars, he seemed to fill the entire room. Wesson, we are going to show them a different way the galaxy can work, one where taking hostages does not end with a profit, one where the cost of murdering civilians is so high that no rational being would ever consider it again. He walked past Fassel toward the door. Sir, Fassel said, his voice barely above a whisper, the colonists who have already died, the ones we couldn't save. Okonkwo stopped. He did not turn around. "We will remember their names," he said. "Every single one, and we will make sure that their deaths are the reason no one ever tries this again." He walked out. Behind him, the machinery of human warfare continued to turn, silent and vast and utterly without mercy for anyone who had chosen to stand in its path. Far away in the dark between the stars, 3 fleets moved like ghosts through spaces that should have been empty, heading toward a reckoning that the galaxy would never forget. Captain Rhea Chen lay flat on her stomach in a drainage ditch at the edge of the colony town of Heraklion, New Thessaly's largest settlement, and watched a Vrelak patrol walk past 6M. From her face, there were 4 of them, big and heavy in their bone-colored armor, carrying plasma rifles that were almost as long as Chen was tall. They moved with the lazy confidence of soldiers who believed they had already won. She waited until they passed, then slid backward through the ditch and into the shattered remains of a greenhouse. The glass walls had been blown out during the initial invasion, and the plants inside, tomatoes, she thought, or something like tomatoes, had already begun to wilt and brown in the unfiltered sunlight. A hand reached out from behind a row of planting beds and pulled her through a gap in the wall that she would not have seen if she had not already known it was there. The hand belonged to Sergeant Major Thomas Guerrero. He was 71 years old. He had a face like cracked leather, a white mustache that he kept perfectly trimmed, even now, and hands that were scarred from 40 years of military service, followed by 20 years of farming. He had retired to New Thessaly because he liked the quiet and the sunlight and the way the wheat fields looked at sunset. He had expected to die here peacefully, in his bed many years from now. Instead, he was crouched in the ruins of a greenhouse, organizing a resistance movement with the same calm efficiency that had once made him the most respected non-commissioned officer in the Terran Marine Corps. 3 more patrols since you left, he told Chen, leading her through a narrow passage between collapsed walls to a basement that the Vrelak had not yet found. "They're getting nervous. Kajatan expected Earth to respond by now. Silence is making them twitchy." "Good," Chen said. "Twitchy soldiers make mistakes." The basement was crowded. 32 colonists sat or lay in the dim light, and every one of them looked at Chen when she entered. They were farmers, teachers, engineers, shopkeepers. 2 weeks ago, the most dangerous thing any of them had dealt with was a broken irrigation pump or a bad harvest forecast. Now they were the core of a resistance cell, and they were doing their jobs with a quiet determination that made Chen proud, in a way she could not quite put into words. A woman named Dr. Adia Zinyasu, she had been the colony's veterinarian, spread a hand-drawn map across a table made from a salvaged door. She had spent the last 4 days crawling through maintenance tunnels and abandoned buildings, mapping every Vrelak position in Heraklion. Her map was detailed, precise, and annotated in a tiny, neat handwriting that would have been impressive in a military intelligence officer, let alone a woman who normally spent her days treating cattle for parasites. "There are 3 shield generators protecting the main Vrelak camp," Dr. Nwasu said, pointing to 3 red circles on the map. "Here, here, and here. They create an overlapping field that covers about 2 square kilometers. Anything that tries to land or fire from Orbit in that zone gets deflected. Power source, Chen asked, portable. Fusion cells, each one is guarded by a squad of 8 Vrelak soldiers. They rotate every 6 hours. Guerrero leaned over the map. The rotation is the weak point. There's a 4-minute window during the changeover, when the outgoing squad is left and the incoming squad hasn't fully settled. 4 minutes isn't much, but it's enough. Chen looked at him. Enough for what? The old man's eyes were hard and bright. I spent 20 years growing wheat on this planet. I know every field, every hill, every drainage channel within 100 kilometers of this town. I have 11 people who can move through that terrain at night without being seen. Nanny and I have 3 farming combined, sitting in a barn 2 kilometers south of here that the Vrelak never bothered to search because they assumed farming equipment wasn't dangerous. He paused. They assumed wrong. Chen almost smiled. This was the thing she had been trained to look for on these missions, the moment when civilians stopped being victims and started being a problem for whoever had made them victims. It happened with humans more often and more quickly than it happened with any other species. The galaxy thought it was strange. Humans did not think it was strange at all. It was simply what they did. You got knocked down, you got up, you looked around for something useful, and then you started fighting back with whatever you had. She sent her report to Fleet Command using a tight beam transmitter that was hidden inside what appeared to be a broken water purifier. The signal would bounce off a relay satellite that she had deployed during her insertion, reach a communications buoy in the outer system, and then travel through a chain of relays to Mars. The Vrelak would never detect it. Their sensors were looking for military-grade transmissions, not the faint whisper of a signal disguised as background radiation. While Chen organized the ground resistance, the galaxy was having a very different conversation about humanity. In the Galactic Council chamber, the mood had shifted from confusion to something closer to dread. It had been 5 days since the Terran Confederacy's one-line response, and in those 5 days, humanity had done nothing visible. When no fleet movements had been detected, no diplomatic channels had been opened, no counter demands had been issued, the Terrans had simply gone silent, and that silence was starting to terrify everyone. Counselor Yathani of the Larathi matriarchy sat in her private office above the council chamber and stared at a report that one of her intelligence analysts had prepared. The report was titled Human Behavioral Patterns in Crisis Situations, a historical analysis, and it was the most frightening document she had ever read. The analyst, a young Larathi named Bethan, had spent 3 years studying human history. He had examined every major conflict humanity had fought, from their ancient tribal wars to their world wars to their colonial rebellions to their first interstellar engagements. When he had looked for patterns in how humans responded to different types of threats, what he had found was simple and deeply unsettling. When humans were faced with a threat that they could negotiate around, they were loud, they argued, they debated. They made speeches and filed complaints and held protests. They were messy and noisy, and they took forever to make decisions because every single human seemed to believe they had a right to an opinion about everything. But when humans were faced with a threat that crossed certain lines, and the killing of civilians, especially children, was the brightest and most absolute of those lines. They went quiet, the arguments stopped. The debates ended, the noise disappeared, and then something terrible happened to whoever had made them go quiet. Yathani had lived among aliens. For most of her career, she had studied species that ate their own young, species that communicated through chemical warfare, species that had no concept of individual death because they existed as a single shared consciousness. She had thought she understood the full range of what intelligent life could be. She had never encountered anything like the cold, organized, systematic fury that humans were capable of when they believed their line had been crossed. She called an emergency meeting of the senior council members, 12 of the oldest and most powerful species sent there. Ambassadors. Yathani stood before them and spoke plainly. I have been studying the humans for 30 years, she said. I have learned their languages. I have read their literature. I have attended their festivals and eaten their food and listened to their music. I believed I understood them. I was wrong. She activated the display and showed them Bethan's analysis. The charts, the patterns, the historical data. When humans make noise, they are processing, they are deciding, they are still open to persuasion. But when they go silent, she paused. Her skin had gone completely still, which among the Larathi was a sign of deep and serious fear. When they go silent, they have already decided. The decision has been made, and what follows is not a battle, it is a consequence. The Chalon ambassador shifted nervously in his seat. Surely you are exaggerating. They are a young species, and the Vrelak have been fighting wars for 600 years. The Vrelak have been bullying smaller species for 600 years. Yathani corrected. That is not the same thing as fighting a war. The Vrelak have never fought a species that refused to play by the rules. They have never fought a species that would rather lose everything than set the precedent that murder is a valid negotiating tool. She brought up one more piece of data, a communication intercept from human space. It showed recruitment numbers across the Terran Confederacy in the days since the crisis began. The numbers were staggering, not because the military had issued a draft or even a call for volunteers. The numbers were staggering because humans were showing up on their own in numbers that overwhelmed every recruitment office in Confederate space. And they are not being ordered to fight, Yathani said quietly. They are choosing to, every single one of them. And they are not choosing out of patriotism or duty or because their government told them to. They are choosing because someone killed their people and broadcast it to the stars, and this is a species that does not allow that to go unanswered. Not now, not ever. Far away in the Vrelak command ship, orbiting New Thessaly, Warlord Kashtan was growing impatient. He paced the bridge of his flagship, his heavy footsteps shaking the deck plates, and demanded updates from his communications officer every hour. Nothing, no response, no counteroffer, no desperate plea for mercy. He had conquered 11 species with this method. Every single one of them had broken within 48 hours. They always did that. You took something they loved, you threatened to destroy it, and they came crawling to you with whatever you demanded. It was the simplest equation in the galaxy. But the humans were not solving the equation. The humans were not even, acknowledging that the equation existed. On the sixth day, Cajetan made a decision that he believed would finally force humanity's hand. He ordered another 100 colonists executed. He chose them carefully. Families with young children, elderly couples, people whose deaths would make the most emotional impact when broadcast. He lined them up in the colony's central plaza in front of cameras that would send the footage to every corner of known space. And he gave the order. The footage went out. The galaxy watched. A species that had been holding their breath for almost a week waited for the Terran response. The response was more silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Now, across human space, something changed in the hours after that second broadcast. It was subtle. You could not point to any single moment or any single event and say, there, that is where it happened. But anyone who was paying attention could feel it, the anger that had been burning hot since the crisis began. Cooled, it did not disappear. It concentrated. It became dense and hard and sharp, like carbon being compressed into diamond. Humans stopped talking about the crisis. In their cafes and living rooms and offices, they stopped arguing about it. On their networks, they stopped expressing outrage and grief and fury. They simply went quiet, one by one, household by household, world by world, until the entire species seemed to be holding a single collective breath. On the Vrelak command ship, Cajetan took the silence as proof that humanity had given up. He told his officers that the humans had abandoned their colony. He mocked them publicly. He called them cowards and weaklings and said that they did not deserve the worlds they held. His intelligence officer, a younger Vrelak, named Subcommander Thren, was not so sure. She had been monitoring human communication channels since the crisis began, and what she was seeing disturbed her. She tried to tell the warlord that the absence of communication was not the same as the absence of action. She tried to tell him that she could not find the Terran 4th and 7th or 12th strike fleets on any sensor network, and when that ships that large did not simply vanish unless someone very smart was making them vanish on purpose. Cajetan dismissed her concerns. He had been conquering worlds since before Thren was born. He knew how this worked. In the basement beneath the destroyed greenhouse in Heraklion, Captain Shen's communicator pulsed once. She picked it up and read the message. It was 2 words long: midnight tomorrow. She looked across the room at Sergeant Major Guerrero, who was sitting on an overturned bucket cleaning a plasma pistol that he had taken from a dead Vrelak soldier 3 nights ago. The old man met her eyes and read the answer in her face before she said a word. He stood up. He tucked the pistol into his belt, and he began to wake the others. Above them, the stars turned slowly in the dark sky of New Thessaly. And way home, and somewhere out there, invisible and silent, and coming closer with every passing second, 3 fleets full of very quiet, very angry humans raced toward their appointment with a warlord who had made the worst mistake of his life. At exactly midnight, Terran Standard Time, 3 things happened at once, separated by hundreds of light years but connected by a single, unified purpose. The first thing happened on the ground. Captain Rhea Chen crouched in the darkness at the edge of the Vrelak camp's eastern perimeter, watching the shield generator through pair of optical enhancers that turned the night into shades of gray and green. The generator was a squat, ugly machine, about the size of a small house, humming, with the deep vibration of contained fusion energy. 8 Vrelok soldiers stood guard. Around it, either their plasma rifles, held loosely in the way of soldiers who had been standing watch for days without anything happening. Behind Chen spread out across 600 m of farmland in drainage ditches and collapsed buildings. 31 colonists waited in absolute silence. They were farmers and teachers and engineers and one veterinarian who had turned out to have a remarkable talent for demolitions. They were armed with a collection of stolen Vrelok weapons, improvised explosives, and 3 farming combines that Sergeant Major Guerrero had spent 4 days converting into something that was technically still a piece of agricultural equipment, but could also punch through reinforced armor plating. At close range, Chen watched the guard rotation begin. The outgoing squad formed up and marched away from the generator, while the incoming squad appeared around the corner of a prefabricated building, walking toward their posts. There was a gap, 4 minutes, maybe less. Chen clicked her communicator twice, 2 short pulses of nothing that meant everything. Guerrero moved first. The old man came out of the wheat field like a ghost, silent despite his 71 years, and put a stolen plasma charge on the generator's power coupling with hands that did not shake even slightly. 2 colonists followed him, placing charges on the secondary and tertiary couplings. They had practiced this in the dark for 2 nights, timing themselves with a broken wristwatch that Dr. Noasu had repaired using parts from a medical scanner. 12 seconds, that was how long it took to place the charges, or they were back in the field before the incoming guard squad had reached their posts. At the same moment, 2 other teams hit the other 2 generators. The southern generator was taken down by a team led by a former university professor named Dr. James Haruki, who had never held a weapon in his life before last week, and who now carried a Vrel plasma pistol with the grim confidence of a man who had decided that principles about violence were a luxury he could no longer afford. The western generator was disabled by a team that included a 16-year-old girl named Sophia Marin, who had crawled through a sewage pipe to reach the generator's cooling system and jammed it with a piece of ceramic tile that she had shaped with her own hands to fit exactly the right gap. The charges detonated simultaneously. 3 deep thumps that shook the ground and sent columns of blue-white light into the sky. The overlapping shield dome that had protected the Vrel camp flickered once, twice, and then collapsed like a soap bubble. Kajetan was asleep in his command center. When the shields went down, he woke to the sound of alarms and the shaking of the building and the panic shouting of his officers. He roared for a status report. His communications officer began to answer. He never finished because that was when the second thing happened. Above New Thessaly, in the asteroid belt that ringed the outer system, space itself seemed to tear open. Hyperspace exit points bloomed like white flowers in the dark. Not 1, not 5, but dozens of them, appearing in a pattern so tight and so precise that the Vrel sensor operators stared at their screens in disbelief. No species made jumps that close to a gravity well. No species dropped out of hyperspace inside an asteroid belt. The navigation calculations alone would take years. The margin for error was measured in meters. The Terran 4th and 7th Strike Fleets arrived in the New Thessaly system like a fist closing around a throat. 87 warships, carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and at their center the battleship TCS Reckoning Admiral Okonkwo's flagship, a kilometer-long mountain of armor and weapons that had been built for exactly one purpose and had never once been used for that purpose until now. The Veralac fleet was caught completely unprepared. Their ships were spread in the wide display formation that Kajatan had ordered to look impressive. Their shields were at standard power. Their fighter wings were docked. They had been sitting in orbit for a week, with nothing to do except wait for a negotiation that was never coming. And their readiness had decayed the way readiness always decays when soldiers get bored. Okonkwo did not give a speech. He did not issue a warning. He did not demand surrender. He opened a single channel to his fleet and said 4 words, all ships weapons free. The Terran fleet hit the Veralac formation like a hammer hitting glass. The first volley alone disabled 6 Veralac warships, what railgun slugs, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed punch through hull armor that had been designed to withstand the weapons of species that fought like the Brelac expected everyone to fight with caution, with restraint, with an eye toward the negotiating table. Humans did not fight with an eye toward the negotiating table, not today. Today they fought the way their ancestors had fought in their darkest and most desperate hours, with total commitment, zero hesitation, and the absolute understanding that the only acceptable outcome was the complete elimination of the enemy's ability to hurt anyone ever again. The battle above New Thessaly lasted 4 hours. It was not a close fight. The Vrelak outnumbered the humans nearly 1 to 1, but numbers meant nothing against a fleet that had trained for this exact scenario for decades. Human ships moved in coordinated wolf pack formation, 3 or 4 ships, focusing their fire on single targets, overwhelming shields, and then moving to the next. Vrelak ships tried to regroup, tried to form defensive lines, tried to coordinate a counterattack, but every time they began to organize, a Terran destroyer group was already there, cutting them apart before they could consolidate. On the ground, Guerrero led his people out of hiding the moment the shields fell. His 3 modified farming combines rolled through the Vrelak camp like armored vehicles, their reinforced blades tearing through prefab walls and barriers. Behind them, armed colonists moved through the chaos, freeing prisoners, securing buildings, and in fighting with a desperate ferocity that the Vrelak soldiers were completely unprepared for. A Vrelak squad commander later said, testimony that the worst moment of the battle was when he rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a human woman holding a plasma rifle in one hand and a small child in the other. The child was crying. The woman was not. She shot him 3 times and then kept moving without breaking stride. Guerrero himself took out the main Vrelak gun emplacement that had been set up in the colony's central plaza, the same plaza where 300 colonists had been executed over the past week. He drove his combine directly into the emplacement at full speed, the machine screaming and sparking as it crushed the weapon platform beneath its weight. When he climbed out of the wreckage with a cut on his forehead and a broken wrist, and a look on his face that made the surviving Vrelak soldiers in the area drop their weapons and surrender without being asked. By the third hour the ground was secured, by the fourth hour the sky was clear, and that was when the third thing happened. 900 light-years away, above the blue-green surface of Vrelak Prime, the homeworld of the Vrelak Dominion, space tore open one more time. The Terran 12th Strike Fleet arrived in perfect formation. 42 warships arranged in a crescent pattern that placed them in a geostationary orbit above the Vrelak capital city. Below them, 9 billion Vrelak looked up at their sky and saw something that no enemy had ever brought to their doorstep. In 600 years of conquest, when the 12th Fleet did not fire, they did not deploy fighters, they did not target weapons or charge shields beyond standard defensive levels. They simply arrived, settled into orbit, and broadcast a message on every frequency the Vrelak used. The message was calm, it was polite, and it was the most terrifying thing that 9 billion Vrelak had ever heard. People of the Vrelak Dominion, your warlord Khajiit made a choice. He chose to take our people. He chose to kill our civilians. He chose to use their lives as currency to buy himself an empire. We want you to understand what his choice has cost you. Look up, see what is above your world right now. We are not here to destroy you. We are not here to conquer you. We are not here to demand tribute or submission or apology. We are here so that you understand completely and permanently that we could today, tomorrow, any day we choose. Your warlord gambled your safety on the belief that we would not come. He was wrong. We want you to remember that he was wrong, and we want you to decide as a people whether you will allow anyone to make that gamble with your lives ever again. The message repeated every 30 minutes for 72 hours. The Vrelak homeworld defense fleet, 26 ships strong, was scrambled within minutes of the 12th Fleet's arrival. They formed up at a safe distance and waited for orders. The orders never came because the Vrelak military command on the ground was having the fastest and most panicked argument in their species' history about whether engaging the humans would result in the destruction of their home world. They decided it would. They stood down. The 12th Fleet held position for exactly 72 hours, then turned and jumped away without firing a single shot. Back at New Thessaly, the battle was over. Kashtan's flagship had been disabled deliberately, precisely, its engines and weapons destroyed while its life support was left intact. A Marine boarding team cut through the airlock and found the warlord on his bridge, surrounded by the bodies of his own officers who had tried to flee and been killed by his personal guard. Kashtan was dragged from the wreckage in restraints. He was enormous even by Vrelak standards, and it took 4 Marines to hold him as he thrashed and roared. He looked at the human soldiers around him with burning yellow eyes and snarled, "Fools, you could have saved them all, every one of your precious colonists. All you had to do was negotiate. All you had to do was give me what I wanted. But your pride, your stupid, worthless pride has cost the lives of 1,400 of your own people." The Marine holding his left arm was a young corporal named David Osai. He was 23 years old. He had a round face and gentle eyes, and he had been told clear his throat 3 hours ago that his older sister, a teacher at New Thessaly's primary school, was among the dead. She had been killed in the first round of executions, shot in the plaza while her students watched. Corporal Osai leaned in close to the warlord's face. His voice was steady, his eyes were dry. "And if we had negotiated," he said, "you would have done this again, too. Another colony, to another world, too. Someone else's sister. We didn't save 1,400 people today. But we saved every person you would have taken next, and every person after that. And every person after that forever." He straightened up and tightened his grip on the warlord's restraints. "That is worth more than you will ever understand." Kajetan stared at him. For the first time in his life, the warlord of the Vrel Dominion had absolutely nothing to say. Above them the stars shone cold and bright over a colony that was broken and bleeding and free. And across the galaxy, every species that had been watching began to realize that the rules they had lived by for thousands of years had just changed permanently, because one stubborn, furious, grief-stricken species had decided that some things were more important than survival. 6 months passed. The galaxy did not forget. The galaxy could not forget it, because the consequences of what had happened at New Thessaly kept spreading outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, touching everything. They reached and changing it in ways that no one had predicted. The Vrel Dominion collapsed. It did not collapse because of the battle. It collapsed because of what came after. True to Admiral Okonkwo's orders, the Terran 4th and 7th Strike Fleets did not return home after liberating New Thessaly. They moved through Vrel sovereign space like a slow, methodical storm, jumping from system to system, targeting every military shipyard, every weapons factory, every fleet staging area, every orbital defense platform. They did not attack civilian targets. They did not bombard cities or destroy infrastructure that served the general population. They simply erased the Vrel Dominion's ability to project military force, one installation at a time, with the patient thoroughness of surgeons removing cancer. It took 11 weeks. When they were finished, the Vrelak military, the institution that had defined their civilization for 6 centuries, that had conquered 11 species, that had built an empire spanning 43 star systems, was gone. Not weakened, not reduced. Gone. The Vrelak still had their worlds, their cities, their people, their culture. They simply no longer had the ability to threaten anyone. And then, to the astonishment of the entire galaxy, the humans went home. They did not occupy Vrelak space. They did not install a puppet government. They did not demand reparations or tribute or territory. They destroyed the weapons, and then they left. And when the Galactic Council demanded an explanation, Ambassador Voss said simply, "We are not conquerors. We are not empire builders. We removed a threat. The threat has been removed. What the Vrelak do with their worlds now is their own business." This confused the galaxy almost as much as the war itself had. Every species in the Council's history that had achieved the kind of total military victory the humans had just won had used it to expand their territory, to extract wealth, to dominate the defeated. The idea of winning absolutely and then walking away was so foreign to the galactic diplomatic framework that 3 Separate species analysts published papers arguing that the humans must have a secret long-term plan that no one had figured out yet. They did not have a secret plan. They had simply done what they said they were going to do, nothing more and nothing less, and the galaxy did not know how to process that. On Vrelek Prime, the aftermath was chaotic but ultimately transformative. The population had spent 72 hours watching a Terran fleet hover above their capital city, and the experience had broken something in the collective psyche of a species that had always believed itself to be the strongest thing in the galaxy. When the military caste tried to reassert control after the humans left, the civilian population refused. For the first time in Vrelek history, ordinary citizens stood in the streets and said no. Khajiit was put on trial, not by humans. The Terran Confederacy had insisted firmly and repeatedly that the Vrelak must judge their own. This decision baffled the council. Fida, the Lorathi ambassador, argued that the humans had earned the right to punish the warlord themselves. The Chalon Merchants Guild suggested that an independent tribunal would be more fair. A dozen species offered to host the proceedings. Ambassador Voss declined every offer. She stood in the council chamber and explained why in terms that were so simple they almost sounded like she was talking to children. If we punish him, then this is about revenge. If his own people punish him, then this is about accountability. We do not want the Vrelak to fear us. We want them to look at what Khajiit did and decide for themselves that it was wrong. That is how you change a species, not with a boot on their neck and with a mirror in front of their face. The Vrelak tribunal convicted Khajiit and sentenced him to permanent exile on an uninhabited moon at the edge of their space. He would live out his days alone, which, for a Vrelak, a species that measured status entirely through social hierarchy, was a punishment far worse than death. The humans said nothing about the sentence. They did not comment on whether it was harsh enough or too harsh. They simply noted that justice had been served by the Vrelak people and moved on. On New Thessaly, the colony was rebuilding. It was slow, painful work. 1,400 people were dead. Every family on the planet had lost someone. The central plaza in Heraklion, the executions had taken place, had been turned into a memorial. The names of every person killed during the occupation were carved into a wall of pale stone that stood where the gun emplacement had been before. Sergeant Major Guerrero drove a farming combine through it. Guerrero himself was there for the memorial's dedication ceremony. His broken wrist had healed. The cut on his forehead had become a thin white scar. He stood in the crowd with the other colonists and listened to the names being read, and he cried openly without shame because he had known most of those people and he had not been able to save them all, and that was a weight he would carry for whatever years he had left. Captain Chen was there too, standing at the back of the crowd in civilian clothes. She had been offered a promotion and a medal. She had accepted the promotion and declined the medal. Honora, she said that medals were for victories, and what had happened on New Thessaly did not feel like a victory to her. It felt like the least terrible outcome of a situation that should never have happened in the first place. The galaxy watched New Thessaly rebuild and tried to understand what it was seeing. The humans did not rebuild with anger. They did not build monuments to their military triumph or erect statues of admirals and generals. They built memorial to their dead, and then they planted new wheat fields and rebuilt their schools and reopened their new university with its surprisingly good poetry department, and they went on living because that was what humans did. They grieved and then they lived, and they did both at the same time because they had never figured out how to do one without the other. 6 months after the battle, an ambassador, Alara Voss, returned to the Galactic Council chamber. Every seat was filled. Species that normally sent junior representatives had dispatched their senior ambassadors. Species that had not attended a full council session in decades had come out of seclusion. Everyone wanted to hear what the human would say. Voss walked to the center of the chamber. She looked older than she had 6 months ago. There were new lines around her eyes, a new gray in her hair, and she carried herself with the careful, measured movements of someone who was very tired but had one more thing to do before she could rest. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. 6 months ago, she began, I stood in this chamber and told you that my species does not bargain with those who hold guns to the heads of children. Many of you thought I was being reckless. Many of you thought I was being proud. Some of you thought I was being stupid. I want to tell you today, clearly and honestly, what I was being. I was being human. She paused and looked around the room. 342 species looked back at her. I am not here to gloat. I am not here to threaten. I am not here to tell you that humanity is stronger or braver or better than anyone else in this room. We are not. We are a young species, barely 300 years into our journey among the stars, and we have so much to learn from all of you. We want to trade with you. We want to explore with you. We want to build with you and argue with you and share meals and stories and music and all the things that make life worth living among the stars. Her voice was warm. It was genuine. Every species in the room could feel it. But I need you to understand something about us, something that is not negotiable, something that will not change no matter how many years pass or how many treaties we sign or how many friendships clears throat we build. The warmth did not leave her voice, but something else entered it, something solid and heavy and permanent, like bedrock beneath soft soil. If you trade with us fairly, we will be the best trading partners you have ever had. If you disagree with us, we will argue with you until the stars burn out and enjoy every minute of it. If you need help, we will come running, even if it costs us. We will compromise on tariffs and borders and cultural differences and 1,000 other things, because that is what civilized species do. She took a breath. Sekuru, but if you take our people, if you hold human lives in your hands and try to use them as currency, then the negotiation is over, not paused, not delayed, over. And what follows will not be proportional. It will not be measured. It will not stop until the entity responsible no longer has the ability to threaten anyone, anywhere, ever again. This is not a threat. It is a statement of fact. It is who we are. It is who we will always be. She stepped back. The chamber was completely silent, not the uncomfortable silence of shock, but the deep silence of understanding. Something had shifted in the room, in the council, in the galaxy itself. A new truth had been spoken, and everyone President knew it. In the weeks that followed, Voss's speech was broadcast, translated, analyzed, and debated across every corner of known space. It became known as the Voss Doctrine, and it was studied in military academies, diplomatic schools, and history classes on 1,000 worlds. Some species agreed with it, some disagreed, but no one ignored it because the humans had backed up every word with action, and action was the one language that every species in the galaxy understood. 3 species approached the Terran delegation privately within a month of the speech. The Pelori, a small amphibian species that had been paying extortion to a regional warlord for 80 years. The Tannic, an insectoid civilization that had lost 2 colony worlds to raiders and been told by the Council to negotiate. The Dravishi, a peaceful herbivore species that had been slowly eaten alive by a predatory neighbor for 3 generations, while the galaxy looked the other way when they did not come because they thought humans were kind. They came because they had spent their entire histories being told that the only way to survive in the galaxy was to pay the price, accept the loss, and hope that the next predator would be satisfied with less. And now, for the first time, they had seen a species prove that there was another way. The alliances that formed were not military alliances. They were something simpler and more powerful. Mutual commitments that certain things would not be tolerated, that certain lines would not be crossed, and that anyone who crossed those lines would find not one species but several standing in their path, united not by conquest but by the shared belief that some things mattered more than convenience. A Lorathi historian named Vethin, the same analyst who had predicted humanity's response months earlier, published a paper that became the most widely read academic work in galactic history. In it, he coined the term that would define humanity's place in the galaxy for centuries to come. He called them the expensive species, not because they demanded high prices or drove hard bargains, but because crossing them, hurting them, threatening them, trying to use their love for their own people as a weapon against them cost more than any aggressor was willing to pay. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest or the wisest or the most technologically advanced, but they had something that no other species had ever demonstrated so completely: an absolute and unbreakable willingness to pay a higher price to defend a principle than any attacker was willing to pay to violate it, and that, Bethan argued, made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not because of their weapons or their fleets or their soldiers, because of their stubbornness, because of their grief, because of the simple, terrifying fact that they would rather lose everything than teach the universe that their children could be bought and sold. On a quiet evening, 3 months after her speech, Ambassador Voss stood at a viewport in the throne of Accord, watching cargo ships move through the star lanes toward New Thessaly. The colony was recovering, the wheat fields had been replanted, the school had reopened, life was continuing as it always did, or because humans did not know how to stop living any more than they knew how to stop breathing. A young Lorathi diplomat named Salen approached her. They had met once before, briefly, at a reception. Salen was new to the council and still young enough to ask questions that her seniors considered impolite. "Ambassador," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, were you not afraid?" When you sent that message, when you refused to negotiate, were you not afraid that you would lose everything? Voss was quiet for a long time. She watched the cargo ship's small points of light moving against the vast darkness. She thought about New Thessaly. She thought about the names on the memorial wall. She thought about Corporal Assay's sister, who had been a teacher and who had died in a plaza surrounded by children she had been trying to protect. We were terrified, she said finally. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. Every single one of us, from the president to the newest recruit. We were terrified that we were making the wrong choice, that more people would die because of our stubbornness, that the galaxy was right and we were wrong. And the smart thing to do was to pay price and save who we could. She turned to look at the young Larathi. But my species learned something a long time ago, Salin. Long before we ever reached the stars. We learned it in dark times, in terrible times. In times when it seemed like the whole world was burning and there was nothing left to hold on to. She smiled. It was a sad smile. It carried the smile of a species that had seen too much suffering to ever be truly carefree, but had never let that suffering make them cruel. If you let fear make you feed your children to the wolf never stops coming to your door. Salin stared at her, then slowly she nodded. They stood together at the viewport for a while longer, watching the ships move through the dark toward a small stubborn colony that had survived the worst the galaxy could throw at it, and was already growing again. Across the galaxy in the months and years that followed, a new advisory was quietly added to the first contact protocols of every species that maintained diplomatic relations with the Terran Confederacy. It was short, it was simple, it was the most important piece of diplomatic guidance that anyone had ever written. It said, Galaxy warning. Humans don't bargain with murderers. Plan accordingly, and in a galaxy that had run on bargains and compromises and carefully measured surrenders for 100,000 years. That single sentence changed everything.